This is surprisingly not something that's new. I was surprised to learn that this whole corporate personhood thing goes back hundreds of years. And Ted, you wrote a book, Gangs of America, and you get into a little bit of the history. Would you share a little bit of that history of corporate personhood with us this evening?
Sure. The history of the United States vis-a-vis corporations really paints a different picture than what we learn in civics class, which really doesn't talk much about corporate power at all. The situation that we have today, where corporations are accepted as a dominant institution, was really completely different before, say, the 1890s, and especially before the Civil War. At that time, it was taken for granted in American society that large concentrations of private power, such as corporations, were fundamentally antagonistic toward democratic principles. And this is reflected in quotes of people like Jefferson, who said, "I hope we shall crush the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations." Now, Jefferson and others of his generation had had the experience of direct conflict with corporate power, not just in courts, but actually, fighting with guns, with muskets, with cannons. The outbreak of the Revolutionary War was an event called the Boston Tea Party. We think of that as some kind of attack on the ships of the king, but actually it was an attack on the ships of the East India Company. And it was the men who disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians to attack the ships were actually the tea merchants of Boston, who were facing monopoly encroachment by the East India Company, which wanted to take over the tea trade. That kind of experience caused the framers of the American system of government to set up a system that lasted for an entire century after the Constitution. And under that system, corporations were required to be public service organizations. They were required to have a stated public purpose. If that purpose was not fulfilled, attorneys general would take their charters away and their charters would be terminated. They weren't given indefinite existence the way they are today, but they were given terms of 20 to 30 years, at which time they'd have to renew their charter. The physical location and the legal location of corporations at that time had to be one and the same. So you couldn't have a corporation hiding behind the laws of the state of Delaware or moving to the Bahamas. A corporation had to be rooted in the democratic institutions of the people. All that changed in the late 1800s through a series of legislative changes and particularly a series of court decisions. There have been a series beginning in 1886 that have extended all the way up into the 1990s. The Keystone decision was in 1886, right here in the Bay Area, the case of Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad. And in that case, for the first time, the written decision of the court stated that corporations would be considered persons for purposes of applying the equal protection provisions of the 14th Amendment. Now, the interesting thing about that case is when the judges walked away from the proceedings where the decision was announced, the pro-corporate judges and the corporate attorneys were actually disappointed, and this is reflected in their correspondence with each other. They felt they had lost the case. Well, it turns out that they had. There was no constitutional protection for corporations written into that case. It only appeared months later when the written proceedings of the decision were released. This was actually not discovered, the discrepancy was not discovered by scholars until the 1960s. But it's a pretty well established fact that this particular decision was really quite illegitimate. It had to do with an intrigue, a behind the scenes maneuver by the court reporter, a man named J.C. Bancroft Davis. Well, if this fundamental tenet of our judicial doctrine was never quite legitimate, then everything else is called into question. Since that time, there have been 11 subsequent major decisions establishing additional corporate rights, of which the most important happened in the 1980s when corporations first won First Amendment protections. Those First Amendment protections are key because they have been the obstacle for meaningful campaign finance reform laws. So that's really the framework. We have a strong anti-authoritarian tradition in the United States. And in long periods of time during our nation's history, those anti-authoritarian sentiments were actually embodied in law. People saw a distinction between economically effective corporations, which they wanted, and politically powerful corporations, which they didn't want. And they believed that you could have both. You could have economically powerful corporations at the same time as you could prevent corporations from running the country. That knowledge that there can be a distinction is what we've lost.
Mm.